London in 1888 was a city of contrasts. To the west, grand avenues and gleaming palaces stood as testaments to the empire's wealth. In the East End, however, the story was different. The gaslit alleys of Whitechapel were shrouded in fog, filled with the scent of soot, desperation, and stale ale. For the poor who called Whitechapel home, life was a relentless struggle. Narrow streets twisted like veins through decaying tenements, where families of 6 or more crammed into single rooms. The factories and docks of the city kept men employed by day, but as the sun set, the streets belonged to thieves, drunks, and those desperate enough to sell their bodies for a few coins. It was in this forgotten corner of London that history's most infamous serial killer emerged. The murders that began in August 1888 were not the first to plague Whitechapel. Violence was nothing new here. Yet, this was different. The killer was precise. He struck in silence, vanishing without a trace, leaving behind mutilated bodies and more questions than answers. Over a century later, his name still evokes shivers. Jack the Ripper. This is the story of those dark days, the women whose lives were taken, and the endless search for a man who became a myth. In the late 19th century, Whitechapel was synonymous with poverty. The Industrial Revolution had swelled the city's population, and immigrants from across Europe sought refuge in London's East End. The promise of work brought hope, but the reality was far grimmer. Tenement buildings rose high, their bricks blackened by the smoke of nearby factories. Streets reeked of horse manure and waste, with open sewers running alongside footpaths. Ragged children played in the gutters, while their mothers queued at market stalls, bargaining for scraps to feed their families. For women, survival often meant making difficult choices. Prostitution was not just common, it was a necessity. On any given night, hundreds of women lined the streets, hoping for enough money to secure a room in one of Whitechapel's crowded lodging houses. Those who failed to earn enough spent the night under bridges or in doorways. The pubs were filled with dock workers, sailors, and drifters. Alcohol numbed the harshness of their lives, but it also bred violence. Fights spilled out into the streets, where the gas lamps cast long shadows but offered little safety. Police constables patrolled the alleys, but there were never enough to truly control the chaos. Whitechapel was not just home to the desperate. It was a sanctuary for those who thrived in the darkness. Petty criminals, pimps, and gangsters blended seamlessly with the crowds, operating with impunity. Into this world stepped a killer who knew how to navigate the labyrinthine streets. His prey would be the women who worked them, and Whitechapel's crowded alleys provided the perfect cover. By the summer of 1888, the stage was set. The world's most notorious killing spree was about to begin. The dawn of August 31st, 1888, was quiet in Whitechapel. The streets, often alive with noise, were still, save for the footsteps of workers beginning their day. At around 3:40 a.m., Charles Cross, a carman heading to work, walked down Bucks Row, a narrow street near the East London Railway. There, on the cold stones of the pavement, he saw something, or someone, lying motionless against a gateway. Stepping closer, he realized it was a woman. Her dress was pulled up around her knees, and the dim light of a nearby gas lamp revealed her throat slashed wide open. Blood pooled around her, soaking into the cobblestones. Cross hurried to find a police officer. Soon after, Constable John Neal arrived at the scene. By the time Dr. Llewellyn was summoned, it was clear that nothing could be done. The woman was dead, and the wounds were far too severe to have been inflicted by mere robbery. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, Polly to those who knew her. She was 43 years old, homeless, and struggling with alcoholism. Like many women in Whitechapel, Polly had turned to prostitution to survive. But this was no ordinary attack. Polly's throat had been cut twice with surgical precision. What shocked Dr. Llewellyn most, however, was the mutilation to her abdomen. The killer had not just murdered Polly, he had butchered her. News of Polly Nichols' death spread quickly, but the significance of the crime was not yet fully understood. After all, Whitechapel was no stranger to violence. Few could have imagined that Polly's murder was only the beginning. 8 days after Polly Nichols' murder, Whitechapel awoke to another horror. On the morning of September 8, 1888, a woman named Elizabeth Long was walking along Hanbury Street just before dawn. As she passed the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street, she noticed a man and a woman talking quietly. The man had his back to her, but the woman's voice carried a familiar East End accent. Moments later, John Davis, a resident of the lodging house at 29 Hanbury Street, stepped into the backyard. His scream pierced the morning stillness. There, lying next to the steps, was the mutilated body of Annie Chapman. Annie was in her 40s, like Polly Nichols, and had endured a similar life: poverty, alcoholism, and prostitution. But what distinguished this murder was its gruesomeness. Annie's throat had been slashed, but the mutilation went far beyond that. Her abdomen had been cut open, and her internal organs were removed and placed beside her body. The nature of the wounds suggested more than mere brutality. There was precision in the cuts, leading some to speculate that the killer possessed medical knowledge. The community's fear began to mount. 2 murders in the space of a week, both following a similar pattern. The whispers grew louder. Whitechapel had a killer in its midst, one who seemed to strike with chilling calculation. The night of September 29th, 1888 was chilly, and the fog hung low over Whitechapel. The streets, as usual, were lively. Despite the fear gripping the area, people sought refuge in taverns, hoping the presence of others would shield them from the dangers lurking outside. By the early hours of September 30th, Elizabeth Stride was seen standing near Berner Street. Known as Long Liz, she was a Swedish immigrant and prostitute. Around 1 a.m., her body was discovered in Dutfield's yard. Her throat had been slashed, but unlike the previous victims, there were no mutilations. It appeared that the killer had been interrupted, but the Ripper wasn't finished. Less than an hour later, Catherine Eddowes was found in Mitre Square, a short distance away. This murder bore all the hallmarks of the killer's previous work. Catherine's throat had been cut, and her abdomen was savagely mutilated. Her face, too, was slashed, perhaps as a final act of rage or to obscure her identity. The discovery of 2 bodies within an hour sent Whitechapel into a frenzy. Newspapers dubbed it the double event. The city's police force now faced intense public scrutiny. Panic set in, and women were warned not to walk the streets alone. By November 1888, Whitechapel had become a city gripped by terror. Curfews were imposed unofficially, and rumors swirled about the killer's identity. Yet, despite heightened patrols and community watchfulness, Jack the Ripper struck again. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest and most striking of the victims. Unlike the others, Mary was murdered indoors in the small room she rented in Miller's Court. On the morning of November 9th, her landlord's assistant knocked on her door, demanding overdue rent. When no answer came, he peered through the window. What he saw was more horrific than anything the city had witnessed. Mary's body lay sprawled across her bed. Her throat was cut down to the spine, but the mutilations didn't stop there. The walls were spattered with blood, and parts of her body were scattered across the room. She was so severely disfigured that even those who knew her struggled to identify her. The brutal murder of Mary Jane Kelly marked the end of the Ripper's reign of terror. No further murders followed, and just as suddenly as he had appeared, Jack the Ripper seemed to vanish. With 5 dead women and no suspect in custody, the East End erupted in fear and anger. Whitechapel became a city of suspicion. Every man who appeared out of place was questioned. Neighborhoods organized vigilante groups. The police, overwhelmed by criticism, increased patrols and began rounding up known criminals. But the Ripper eluded them. Women, especially those working the streets, grew increasingly fearful. Some carried knives or traveled in groups. Lodging houses became overcrowded, as no one wished to sleep outdoors. The murders, though concentrated in Whitechapel, sent shockwaves across London. Newspapers printed gruesome illustrations. selling copies by the thousands. Editorials criticized the government's failure to protect the poor, and Parliament faced mounting pressure to take action. Jack the Ripper had done more than kill. He had exposed the deep divisions in Victorian society. In the weeks following the double event, the Metropolitan Police received hundreds of letters from the public, each claiming to reveal the identity of Jack the Ripper. Most were hoaxes or written by pranksters. But 3 letters stood out. The first, postmarked September 25, 1888, was addressed to the Central News Agency. Written in red ink, it was signed Jack the Ripper. It taunted the police and promised further murders. The second letter, known as the Saucy Jack postcard, arrived shortly after the double event. It claimed responsibility for the murders and mocked the police for their inability to catch him. The third, and perhaps most chilling, was the From Hell letter. Sent to George Lusk, head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, it arrived alongside a small box. Inside was half a human kidney, believed by some to belong to Catherine Eddowes. The authenticity of these letters remains debated, but they cemented Jack the Ripper's place in history. The killer, faceless and nameless, had given himself an identity. As Jack the Ripper's murders escalated, so too did the efforts to capture him. The Metropolitan Police, led by Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, faced immense pressure from the public and the press. The City of London Police also became involved, particularly after Catherine Eddowes was murdered within their jurisdiction. Detectives scoured Whitechapel streets, questioning hundreds of residents and lodging housekeepers. They followed leads, interrogated suspects, and monitored the activities of known criminals. Yet, despite their efforts, the Ripper seemed to slip through their grasp time and again. The lack of witnesses frustrated investigators. The killer struck in the dead of night, in dark alleys where few dared to tread. Those who claimed to have seen him offered conflicting descriptions. Some said he was tall and dark. Others swore he was short and fair-haired. The press fueled the hysteria. Newspapers competed for sensational headlines, often publishing unverified rumors and gruesome illustrations of the crimes. The public's fascination with the case grew, turning Jack the Ripper into a macabre celebrity. Despite the fog of misinformation, the police began piecing together a profile. The killer, they believed, was methodical and possessed at least a rudimentary knowledge of anatomy. He appeared to target women who worked as prostitutes, striking swiftly and without hesitation. Still, no arrests were made. Over the years, countless suspects have been linked to the Ripper murders. In 1888 alone, the police investigated more than 300 individuals. Some were dismissed immediately, while others became the focus of intense scrutiny. A barrister and schoolteacher, Druitt was found dead in the Thames shortly after the last Ripper murder. His death was ruled a suicide, and some officials believe that the timing of his disappearance coincided with the end of the killings. Druitt was known to suffer from mental illness, leading investigators to speculate that he may have been the Ripper. A Polish immigrant and resident of Whitechapel, Kosminski was a barber with a history of mental instability. He was committed to an asylum in 1891, where he reportedly exhibited violent tendencies. Though Kosminski was a prime suspect, there was little concrete evidence linking him to the crimes. A convicted serial killer, Dr. Cream poisoned several women in the 1890s. Some theorists suggest he began his crimes earlier, adopting the persona of Jack the Ripper. However, Cream was imprisoned during the Ripper murders, casting doubt on his involvement. A prominent physician to the British royal family, Gull became the subject of conspiracy theories linking the murders to the monarchy. These theories, popularized in books and films, suggested that Gull was part of a cover-up orchestrated by the Crown. Though entertaining, most historians regard this theory as implausible. Despite extensive investigation, none of the suspects could be definitively identified as Jack the Ripper. The killer's true identity remains one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history. As the murders continued, frustration among Whitechapel's residents boiled over. The working-class community felt abandoned by authorities. Pamphlets circulated, accusing the police of incompetence and indifference. In taverns and markets, Rumors swirled that the killer was protected by the upper classes. Vigilante groups began patrolling the streets, determined to catch the Ripper themselves. One such group, the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee, was led by George Lusk. Frustrated by the police's failure, Lusk and his men organized nightly patrols and offered rewards for information leading to the killer's capture. It was to Lusk that the infamous From Hell letter was sent. The accompanying kidney, whether genuine or not, terrified the community further. For women, life in Whitechapel became even more dangerous. Many avoided walking alone, while others altered their routes home, hoping to avoid the Ripper's gaze. Lodging houses overflowed with those unwilling to risk the streets at night. Yet, as quickly as the terror began, it faded. After the murder of Mary Jane Kelly, no further killings were attributed to Jack the Ripper. Whitechapel slowly returned to normal, though the scars left behind would never fully heal. By 1889, Whitechapel had begun to rebuild. The fog of fear that had blanketed the East End for months began to lift, but the specter of Jack the Ripper lingered. The press, once obsessed with the murders, shifted focus to other stories. For the residents of Whitechapel, the murders became part of the city's grim folklore, a cautionary tale whispered in darkened alleys. Yet, the case was never officially closed. Detectives revisited the evidence time and again, hoping to find a clue they might have missed. Each passing year brought new theories, new suspects, and new investigations. Books, plays, and films immortalized the Ripper, transforming him from a faceless killer into a legend. Over a century later, Jack the Ripper's name endures. His image is etched into the public imagination, cloaked in shadows, a figure of both fear and fascination. What is it about the Ripper that captivates us still? Is it the brutality of his crimes, the mystery of his identity, or is it the unsettling truth that he was never caught, never punished? Jack the Ripper's legacy is not just one of violence, but of reflection. His murders expose the dark underbelly of Victorian London, the poverty, the neglect, and the stark divide between rich and poor. His victims, Polly Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly, are remembered not for the way they died, but for the lives they led. Women who struggled, endured, and ultimately fell victim to a world that failed to protect them. As long as their stories are told, Jack the Ripper's shadow will remain, a reminder that even in the brightest of cities, darkness can find a home.